Hi, good afternoon, everyone. For those of us just joining us, welcome. For those of us just coming back from lunch, glad to have you back here for our second panel, Session 2, Collection Use. My name is David Breslin. I'm the DeMartini Family Curator and Director of Curatorial Initiatives here at the Whitney. And before we begin, I'd like to share some access information. For those joining us virtually, you can access closed captioning in English by turning on this feature on the options bar. Thank you to our captioners, Bonnie Rothermel and Nanette Widman. Each session will be a series of presentations followed by conversation among the panelists, followed by time for questions by you, the audience. Restrooms are located outside the theater on this floor. If you need to exit for any reason during the program, please use the doors at the back of the room where you entered. Before jumping into a little bit of a summary about this panel, I just wanted to echo the chorus of people thanking Jane and Kim and Ramsey and Roxanne for their work, both for what it's doing for the Whitney and thinking about its collection, but what it's doing for the larger field and all of us gathered here. So big thanks to you. I'm very pleased to be moderating this panel, which will really get into the questions around collection use. Building on what we heard from our panel this morning, we're excited to consider the ways in which museums of modern and contemporary art are thinking expansively about the very definitions and boundaries of how collections are used. Some of the questions that will be explored are, how is the concept of collection use even defined at particular institutions? Is this something that has changed markedly, the idea of use in recent years? Once a work is acquired, what are the questions around use that are questioned and brought into perspective? And who and what can a collection serve, and how are these goals prioritized? To help us explore these questions and open up even more, I'm very happy to be joined by three terrific colleagues and panelists, Asma, Paulina, and Jamaal, all colleagues deeply considering these questions. I know, and then within a range of institutions, that these are very distinctive questions and very particular ones that we'll be working through today. So I'll introduce the three speakers. They'll come and then give their presentations, and then we'll be joined together for a panel afterwards. Asma Naeem is the interim co-director and the Eddie C. and C. Sylvia Brown Chief Curator at the Baltimore Museum of Art, where she has organized exhibitions on the work of such artists as Candace Brights and Isaac Julian. Prior to the BMA, she held curatorial positions at the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery. She's written widely on American art, contemporary art, critical race theory, the South Asian diaspora, and museum studies. Her book, Out of Earshot, Sound, Technology, and Power in American Art, 1847 to 1897, was published by the University of California Press in 2020. Paulina Pobocha is Associate Curator in the Department of Painting and Sculpture at the Museum of Modern Art, where she has worked since 2008. At MoMA, she has organized shows such as Constantine Brancusi's Sculpture, 2018, The Long Run with Cara Maines in 2017, and Rachel Harrison, Perth Amboy, 2016. She has also been central to the conception and display of the museum's contemporary collection galleries from the 1970s to the present. Currently, Paulina is working with the artist Thomas Schutte on a forthcoming retrospective exhibition for MoMA. And Jamaal Sheats, MFA, is the Associate Provost of Art and Culture, Director and Curator of Galleries, and Assistant Professor of Art at Fisk University. Since joining the galleries in 2015, he has curated 18 exhibitions, expanded and nurtured relationships, and implemented innovative programs to foster access to and engagement with the collections. So thanks everyone for joining, and please join me in welcoming Asma.
Good afternoon, everybody. I wanted to first say that I have the privilege of speaking right after lunch. So if I see some dozing off, it's totally fine. There's going to be free espresso coming shortly down the aisles. I'm kidding. But hopefully what I will be talking about will be refreshing and engaging enough so that you will stay with me. I want to thank David for that kind introduction. I want to thank Ramsey for her incredible, exquisite coordination. I want to thank Jane and Kim for this incredible convening. This is a critical conversation. I also want to thank the Luce, Terry Carbone, for funding this incredible conversation. We have, if you haven't noticed already, we have some of the best minds in the business here. And we're kind of talking inside baseball, I know, to some of you, but I hope this is stimulating and broad enough to encourage conversations outside of the museum field. So what I'm going to be doing today is talking about those specific prompts that David so kindly read out to you, all of you. And what I wanted to do in this conversation is basically have a series of provocations for all of you, beginning with my time at the National Portrait Gallery and then moving in to the BMA. So let me begin. So the first provocation that I wanted to start with was based on David's, one of the inquiries, which was, what is your definition and application of collection use? So for me, it seems like all of you were oracles in the first morning session, because a lot of comments touched on the questions that I wanted to ask you. What you see here are two silhouettes produced in the mid-1800s by a Frenchman named Auguste Edouard. I'm not going to ask you if you know who these people are. I'll just tell you. The one on the left is John Henry Quincy Adams, right after he argued the Amistad case to the Supreme Court. And the one on the right is a blind woman named Laura Bridgman, who actually inspired Charles Dickens for some of his characters. So this was in the National Portrait Gallery's collection. These silhouettes were. We had them for decades. They were lying in our archives. And what Sydney said, I said I would footnote Sydney. There you are, Sydney. What Sydney said earlier today really rung true, which is generations have different perspectives on objects that have existed in collections. And so when I began at the National Portrait Gallery, I saw these objects and I saw an opportunity here that perhaps others hadn't seen. And that is the ways in which silhouette as a form of portraiture was a democratizing force. It pictured people who could otherwise not afford an oil portrait, who could not afford having somebody come to their home, who couldn't afford the materials that required a portraitist to make an oil portrait. And so very quickly I realized that, yes, there's artists like Carol Walker who were appropriating that language to great critique. And I created 4 women, contemporary women artist practitioners who responded to silhouettes using that collection as an archive, but as a base to begin a conversation. And I wanted to acknowledge several things in why this was an important move for me. First thing is, and I don't think we've said this word yet in this conversation, but the first thing is our stakeholders are numerous, across many different kinds of financial means, across different kinds of backgrounds, but also we have to talk about our donors, and that's the word that I wanted to talk about, our donors and patrons, the ones who have given us these objects that create the collections. I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged and gave pride of place to the work that was done by the donors. At the same time, I wanted to offer a revision of how we can continue to donate and collect, and kind of offer a challenge to those younger folks who were coming in to see the Carol Walker, to think of how they could be gathering kind of inconsequential objects like silhouettes for the generations and futures to come to give to museums. So this was something that was drawing on a permanent collection, set of materials. I now want to go to the temporary, which is what Saisha was asking earlier. Where's Saisha? Yeah, that's exactly what I want to talk about. So permanent versus temporary is a big, big conversation that I don't think we have enough time to talk about today. But so what you see here is a portrait of an enslaved individual who came from Senegambia, came to Annapolis, Maryland, was auctioned off, worked in Tacoma Park, eventually got land in Georgetown when he was manumitted. And the portraitist is the first art professor at the Georgetown University. Why am I showing you this work? Well, when President Trump was voted in, and I heard a conversation that he was having with somebody about Islam and the history of Islam, I realized that I couldn't sit still at the Portrait Gallery, and I realized that I needed to bring in conversations and histories about the ways in which Islam has been represented in the United States. And what I realized very quickly is that the Portrait Gallery had zero portraits that could help me facilitate this conversation. So what I did is, and this is because of NPR, I remembered a story I had heard about this portrait in the public library of Washington, D.C. And so I went to them and asked them for a loan. It was a 3-year loan. And we decided to place this object, this story, in our permanent galleries, right alongside the presidents and the admirals of the time in our historic rooms. And so what I wanted to talk about when I say permanent versus temporary is that our collections have an aura. The collection galleries have an aura. They have a sense of hierarchy that visitors notice. And so when you place things in hallways, when you place things by the bathroom, visitors notice. And so it was very important for me to make sure that this portrait, even though it was not a collection object, was placed in the right historical context, right alongside the presidential portraits. That's number one. Number two, who do you think your collection can serve? How are you prioritizing these goals at your institution? I'm going to say a number of obvious things that I get to say because I'm first in this panel, so forgive me if my co-panelists were about to say this. Artists. So obviously, artists are constantly inspired by the art before their period and of their period, and they look at books, of course, but they also come and look at objects. And so for us, when we had a show with Shah Bilal herself, we found out that she was deeply influenced by Henri Matisse. The Baltimore Museum of Art, where I now am, has the world's largest collection of Henri Matisse in public holdings. And so Shah Bilal came through, looked through our work, and created this work that you see here, Two Women, inspired by a work that was formerly titled Two Negresses by Henri Matisse. That's now been changed. Conservators. This is an important conversation that I would also like to give its due. Conservators are the very backbone of what we do in museums, and the ways in which we could fund a Joan Mitchell study day with conservators looking at the ways in which Joan Mitchell's very complicated and understudied form of painting could be evaluated on a deeper level. That was an important moment. Of course, students. And so what you see here is our new Center for Matisse Studies, the Ruth R. Martyr Center for Matisse Studies. And students obviously also provide an important audience. But what I wanted to say about students is that learning from objects is something that I, as an undergrad, loved, but it's rare. It's really rare to walk into a museum and actually learn about, say, geography or geographical principles through art objects. And that's something that we're trying to encourage in the STEM field because we are on the campus of Johns Hopkins University, and we have many other universities nearby, Morgan State, Coppin, et cetera. So here you see the Ruth R. Martyr Center for Matisse Studies. We have a colleague from the Metropolitan Museum of Art, David's new place of business, Dr. Denise Morel, who will be coming as our fellow, our first fellow, and considering ways to build upon our collection to tell the narratives of the invisible histories, as some of you were saying earlier. We also have a Center for the Study of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, and this is helmed by Dr. Andalee Banta, who has used the opportunities that works on paper provide, which is they tell most of our diversity stories. They tell most of the narratives that many of us in museums are trying to tell can be more easily told through works on paper. They're affordable, they're less risky for investing. There's a number of reasons. And we have, out of our 100,000 objects in the Baltimore Museum of Art's collection, 66,000 of them are works on paper. So, and we're looking to build across the sciences so that we're bringing in students early on. So all of that is fine, good, yes. I know that many of you already know these things, but I wanted to say to you, how else can we use our collections for those who we haven't really thought about? Those who would never even want to walk into a museum. Even if they were put on a bus, they would rather just sit outside and wait for the end of the field trip. I know that's some of you, right? I could see. Okay. So I just wanted to acknowledge that Valerie Maynard, who was, as you see here, one of the first artists in residence at the Studio Museum in Harlem. She just passed on Monday, and I wanted to just acknowledge the beauty and the grace that was Valerie, this octogenarian artist, and show you two works in our collection, because she ended up spending 40 years almost, that was my timer, in Baltimore. So I will wrap it up. So what Valerie said to us very, very briefly was that, I don't know how to turn this off, was that she wanted to have a collection that would bring in young women of color who were in high school. That's where she saw the opportunities. And we began a conversation that we never got to finish. So that's something that I wanted to put out there, in how can we do that work more readily. And I know we're all thinking about these kinds of questions, but I call that out specifically. The last provocation I would put out to you is, what are alternative models and strategies for using collections that we at the BMA, the Baltimore Museum of Art, have explored? We've asked emerging artists, like Beatrice Glow, whose exhibition Once the Smoke Clears is on view right now, to take a look across sensorial applications of our collection. So Beatrice Glow is an innovator in virtual reality, but she also uses as an operational language for herself the olfactory, the sense of smell. And so she looked at our objects and created specific scents based in our indigenous indigenous and early American collections, to talk about the history of the Cantonese, specifically coming out of Canton in Baltimore. So that's one thing that we're looking at. Another thing is, it's the 30th year anniversary of Fred Wilson's Mining the Museum in 2023. That was done in Maryland, in Baltimore. And so Fred is working with us to create a new set of conversations around museum interventions, working with local artists. It's a commissioned competition who are drawing on our collection. So that will be opening next year. The last kind of two things are interrelated. And I show you here Derek Adams's Black Baltimore Digital Database and the Last Resort Artist Retreat that's gotten extensive funding, and I hope will be serving many generations to come. The idea of the living archive. This is something that I know that many collectives were trying to, or even just individuals were trying to amass as art was being made. There's so many folks who are creating art that is yet to be recognized. How can we archive in the present? How does that get into a collection? We're hoping to have a deeper partnership with Derek to think through these questions, because a lot of this ends up being compartmentalized, say in a history museum, or in a specific artist-initiated project. That's the same thing that we're considering with the Afro-American, one of the oldest Black newspapers in the country, based in Baltimore City, that also has had a Mellon Foundation grant. And what I will close with is this: the culture, hip hop, and contemporary art in the 21st century. To the kind gentleman who was talking about street art earlier and graffiti, this is an exhibition that we hope will specifically, and in my essay for the catalog, I do call out this notion of how we get to play the diversity card through temporary shows, and why museums are so reluctant to put these kinds of works into our collections. So you're looking at work that cuts across our understandings of contemporary art. You're looking at wigs made by Dion Alexander. You're looking at fashion. Obviously, yes, we are going to be including Virgil Abloh's collection, but we're also going to be including people and designers who were less well-known, such as Cross Colors, which many of you probably do know. We're also going to be looking at sound art and performance. And I think of my wonderful colleague Thomas Lax in an article he wrote about collectivity and the ways in which collectivity is not acknowledged in collection making because of the ideas and the values that are imposed by certain systemic views of funding. And I know I'm talking a little opaquely here, but I do want to just close and say that what I am trying to say in so many different examples that I've illustrated here is that collections are a reflection of values. And those values have been institutionalized with those in power, and those in power are changing. And so how do we create collections that are moving with our current moment, but still acknowledging the past? How do we account for different tastes? How do we build in these new media? And how do we think of making beyond the singular individual? I don't have an answer, but I thought I would close with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Asma. As a graduate of Johns Hopkins, the Baltimore Museum has a very special place in my heart. I'm now going to talk about MoMA, the place where I've been employed for the last 14 years. Can everyone hear me? So first of all, I want to thank the Whitney Museum and Jane and Kim for the invitation. Our, I think now, years-long conversation on so many of these topics have definitely enriched my thinking on them and on so many other things. And a million thanks to Ramsey, who has endured my inane questions with extraordinary patience. But so to reiterate, well, the prompt that I received, I don't know, maybe it was different from the one that you did, Asma, was the question, how are museums thinking creatively and expanding the boundaries and definitions of how collections are used? To which I can answer, it's complicated. The question, it seems to me, can't be separated from the question of what are collections for in the first place. You can easily imagine a context in which caring for art objects doesn't need a public component. A museum collection does not de facto necessitate display. You can imagine it like an archive, for instance, and yet here we are. I thought it would be useful to begin. So anyway, to begin with the why, I think an official why can usually be found in the succinct language of a museum's mission statement, and so here's MoMA's. The Museum of Modern Art connects people from around the world to the art of our time. We aspire to be a catalyst for experimentation, learning, and creativity, a gathering place for all, and a home for artists and their ideas. The sharing of our collection with our visitors is one way to achieve this, but it's not the only way, and it certainly doesn't exist in a vacuum. And so while we are definitely here to discuss the collection, I think it's useful to keep this larger ecosystem front and center in our minds. MoMA's collection comprises of work made between the end of the 19th century to the present. Within that relatively short span of time sit approximately 225,000 artworks distributed across 6 curatorial departments. And I should note that that number does not account for the majority of our film holdings, nor does it account for things like promised gifts, objects in the study collection, various assets, and so on. It is also a collection that continues to grow. Founded in 1929, the museum has a long history, as many of you know, with many chapters. And I think it's important to underscore that at the time of its founding, Director Alfred Barr, despite his affinity for flowcharts, really understood the museum as a laboratory. In the past decade or so, and certainly in the last few years, we've really begun to really embrace this metaphor as a working model. In 2019, I think someone mentioned earlier, the museum underwent a major expansion, the first in 15 years. And the goal of the expansion was specifically motivated by the need for additional space for the collection, which has increasingly become a central focus of our programming. So floors 5, 4, and 2, the floors that house the collection, were expanded by approximately 30%, yielding a total of close to 85,000 square feet of space that would be devoted to collection display. And this excludes the sculpture garden, the atrium, a variety of public and interstitial spaces. And what would these new collection galleries look like, and how would they function? I think the biggest change was the dissolution of department-specific galleries in favor of a cross-disciplinary display that falls in line with how many artists understand their own work in relation to the work of others and in relation to the world. I should also add that we don't have curators that are devoted to the collection versus ones devoted to special exhibitions. Every curator at MoMA, from curatorial assistants to chief curators, works on the collection. But even so this pie can be sliced many ways. How do you organize the collection? You can imagine a purely thematic approach, for instance. In the end, we decided that maintaining a chronological spine was important, the square footage being sufficiently vast that a clear and easily ascertainable organizational structure seemed necessary. A chronological spine is also surprisingly spry in that it can absorb more than one history at a given moment, but it certainly can't contain everything at once. Embracing plurality and multivalence, being able to address many histories rather than one, is essential to the work that we do. Telling many histories of art, however, in the fixed space of a museum is a difficult endeavor. Even newly told stories can calcify rather quickly. So one way to counter this is to focus on the temporal component of collection display. To that end, we rotate approximately 1/3 of each collection floor during the course of the year. And so let's see how that shakes out. So here are the former painting and sculpture galleries as they were known before expansion. This was the first room as you entered into the collection. A visitor entered and was greeted by Cézanne's Bather and surrounded by the artist's still lives and landscapes, as well as work by Gauguin, Seurat, and Signac. This obviously is not an accident. One of the earliest exhibitions ever staged at MoMA featured those 4 artists. But the signal it sent was clear. Modernism at the Museum of Modern Art began with Cézanne. The second half of the room included Van Gogh's Starry Night, as well as work by Henri Rousseau, James Ensor, and others. And here is the first room of the 5th floor galleries after the expansion. Notice that the target wall is gone, and instead are ceramic vessels by the American potter George Orr. They assume a central position. Cézanne, Rousseau, Van Gogh are all still there. But just this very simple inclusion of Orr opens up the space for other narratives, ones, in this case, taking place outside of Europe. And if you visit the museum today, this is the first room of the 5th floor. You'll see films, photographs, Tiffany lamps, a painting of a streetlight by Giacomo Balla. So maybe modernism doesn't begin with Cézanne and his relentless flattening of space. Maybe it begins with light, or rather electricity, distributed and accessible, a very, I think, different proposition indeed. When we reopened in 2019, there was a gallery featuring Picasso's groundbreaking 1907 painting, Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which you see on the left side of the screen. And this is a painting that is central to the history of modernism at MoMA and a stalwart of the 5th floor. Like typical, the work, it was in company of other Picasso paintings, ones which preceded it, those that followed, with the jarring and provocative exception of Faith Ringgold's 1967 masterwork Die, painted at the height of the civil rights movement. Ringgold's work may at first and maybe often seem alien in this context, but I think it proposes a conversation across time. Ringgold, in fact, spent many hours in front of Picasso's Guernica when the work was semi-permanently on view at MoMA during Franco's regime in Spain. And I think this brings about other questions of temporality and museum practice. If museums serve artists, it's important to acknowledge that artists are never only in dialogue with their contemporaries. Museums allow them to travel through time and perhaps to look to their predecessors as their peers. Another virtue of factoring in the temporal component of display is that it allows multiple histories to unfold over time. I want to show you a gallery which in 2019 was home to conceptual art. Now, same room, 2021, a thematic exploration of the social and political unrest that gripped this country during the 1960s and 1970s. And importantly, the chronologies addressed within both installations are coincident. So if much of the new presentation functions as a proposition, the second floor, where the most contemporary part of the holdings live, does this, I think, most of all. For one, the art history is only now being written. Some galleries are quite straightforward. Early on the floor, for example, there's a room focusing on downtown New York. Many are much more essayistic. For instance, the gallery that you've been looking at, Gallery 215, focuses on on interconnected economies and the global exchange of goods and labor. In the center, you see a work by American artist Terry Adkins. On the back left wall and in the corner, prints and sculpture by Indian artist Shambhavi, and on the right, a photograph by the American artist Latoya Ruby Frazier. There's also space across all floors for monographic presentations or one-work presentations, which range at present from Matisse's late-life masterpiece, The Swimming Pool, made in 1952, to the newly installed work by Tiana Nakia McLaughlin called The Brad Johnson Tape X on Subjugation, which was made in 2017 and acquired earlier this year. And so that was a jump through the chronological installation. Now I want to take you through a series of gestures or movements that further enhance the dynamism of the collection. The first is a break in chronology. So this slide and the two that follow show the same gallery on the 5th floor, so that's the most historical part of the collection. And this gallery is positioned between a gallery devoted to 1920s Paris and a gallery that is really a deep dive into surrealism. And so what we're seeing, what happened? Sorry, I'm like bad at slide things. So this is Amy Silman's brilliant artist choice show, The Shape of Shape. A few months later, that same space is occupied by Gerhard Richter's unforgettable cycle of paintings, October 18th, 1977. And then later, Pepon Osorio's extraordinarily moving installation, Badge of Honor. These all do many things on their own as artworks, but I think in the context of a chronological flow of the collection, they can signal to our visitors that what you see in a museum isn't just there, but that it's very much a consequence of decisions of what we choose to put forth, when, and to what end. Occasionally, you'll encounter loans in the collection galleries. Here is General Ideas Magic Bullet, an installation of pill-shaped mylar balloons responding to the AIDS epidemic, a work in the museum's collection paired with a loan of magic carpet positioned on the floor. And that comes from, like seriously, the artist estate. And now still on view just for a few more weeks, Guadalupe Maravilla's presentation, Luz y Fuerza, which began with the acquisition of 2 sculptures, those are the 2 on the far right, and was then complemented by the loan of 5 works from the artist's studio to create a fulsome presentation of the artist's practice, which included a robust program of sound baths made through the activation of his sculptures that also double as healing instruments. And of course, the stories that a collection can tell depend entirely on the collection itself, and we heard a lot about this earlier this morning. In the past few years, we've made key acquisitions, or as they've been referred to today, surgical acquisitions, whose very presence in the galleries can complicate the history we think we know. And I'm gonna focus, I work in the Department of Painting and Sculpture, so I'm gonna focus on works, this is just a small selection of many works, but I'm gonna focus on works from our department. This is happening across all the departments at the museum. But here, some of these key acquisitions or surgical acquisitions include painting by Paula Modersohn Becker. This is the earliest painting by a woman to enter the collection, made in 1907. A painting by Brazilian artist Tarsila do Amaral. A sculpture by William Edmondson. 4th floor, Hervé Telemaque, Barbara Chase-Ribou, T.C. Cannon. And on the 2nd floor, I would argue that every single acquisition changes the collection, because this is really where we're growing the collection the most. But here are 3 examples that seem especially vital. A group of paintings by Dalton Paula on the top, a sculpture by Maren Hassinger in the bottom left, and a painting by Kamala Ishak on the bottom right. Importantly, all of these new acquisitions, not just these, but in the previous slides, all of these new acquisitions are either currently on view or have recently been on view. So we acquire things, we don't want to put them in storage. That's also part of the idea of this very kind of, I would say, relentless process of rotation. And finally, I will come to a topic that I think holds extraordinary potential, and that's cross-institutional collaboration. Every collection has limitations, and sometimes ones that create glaring historical gaps. Hilma af Klint's paintings belong to her foundation, with which we formed a relationship, resulting in a series of long-term loans so that her work is present, accessible, and in conversation. And similarly, the Muzeum Sztuki in Łódź, Poland, is virtually the only repository of Katarzyna Kobro's extraordinary constructivist sculptures, works that are extraordinarily close to my heart. And I think there are less than 10 of them in existence that survived the World War II. And thanks to this partnership with this museum in Poland, one of them can be seen right now on 53rd Street. So I will end there, but just as a kind of postscript, I didn't at all address temporary exhibitions drawn entirely from the collection, which I think could be a whole nother 10 minutes, nor our robust outgoing loan program, or the way that our collection lives in digital space. We have MoMA magazine, MoMA.org, where the objects that we acquire we kind of build a different type of context for them that could be accessible from anywhere around the world, not just physically. So, thank you. Sorry about the slide.
Fantastic. Good afternoon, everyone. First, I would like to acknowledge and just say thank you to, of course, Ramsey, Jane, Roxanne, and I know I'm missing one other name, Kim, and then also to the Luce Foundation as well. And thinking through the questions, David, you asked some very loaded questions for us to kind of work through today. My name is Jamaal Sheats. I come from Fisk University Galleries. I want to speak just a few minutes just to talk about the institution itself. We're a small liberal arts institution, a historically black college. We have roughly 1,000 students. We have an amazing art collection, and we like to say on campus that the arts are part of the intellectual and cultural fabric of the institution, and that it is. We've been collecting since the 1870s. Now, before we get into the actual use of the collection, I want to just give kind of just a little bit of an overview of the collection. Now, mind you, it's a few slides. I'll go through them rather quickly, but I think it's important for us to at least to give you a glimpse of what's in it. So the first slide, of course, is Alfred Stieglitz from the Alfred Stieglitz collection that we now share with Crystal Bridges. That's something that we're relatively known well for. Of Keith, who donated the collection to Fisk. And I may talk about that painting just a little bit later. And then also Aaron Douglas, who would come to Fisk in 1930s to paint the murals, and then would come back in 37, and then in 1944 to found the art department. These are in the building which was the library that was constructed in 1930. Douglas would come back to Fisk in 1944 to found the art department, and then in 1950, around 1950, Winold Rice would donate a collection to Fisk that's currently on, many of those works are currently on view at the New York Historical Society. David Driscoll would come to Fisk in 1967, and you would see this kind of explosion that would happen on campus. Pictured here is David Driscoll, Earl Hooks, Romare Bearden, Canton, and Catlett. During his tenure, you would see works come in from the Harmon Foundation. The collection itself is vast, over 400 years, but the bulk of it would be modern and contemporary collection, but primarily African-American artists. You would also see William T. Williams coming to campus as well. You would also see Alma Thomas coming to campus. And I chose these artists because all of these artists were particularly having a moment right now. But then the question comes to the use. And the question also comes to think about who is using the collection. At Fisk, we serve many publics. Again, we have a student population of about 1,000 students. But the gallery itself, we have viewership that reaches to over 10,000 annually. And so the thing that we have to talk about first are the publics, the initial public, which is our students, then our faculty, and then a broader community. So to focus on our students, the mandate for us is to integrate the galleries into all academic disciplines. And this is a chart that kind of illustrates that. Now, this is something that is not unique, and again, going back to the cultural heritage of the institution, this is something that Douglas did in 1955, I believe. But the position that I want to talk or have the conversation today about is how do we empower the public? How do we empower our students? So here is a slide of our gallery ambassadors. Our gallery ambassadors would be considered to be the lifeblood of the institution. They provide tours, they give talks, they develop programs. Many of the students that you see pictured here, and this is not the entire body of our gallery ambassador program, we have about 40 that we have on a yearly basis, but you were talking about students or young people wanting not to get off the bus as opposed to coming to the museum. And so I would think that many of our students that come in, though they come from primarily large cities like New York, Chicago, and other places, that the museum intimidates them in a lot of ways. And so a large part of what we do to empower our students is to demystify the museum. And so with that, the students do the work. I'm going to go to the next slide to talk about just some of the programs that our students help us facilitate. So on this slide, you see BIG, Babies in the Gallery. It's a fun program. It is awesome. We have changing tables. We have all of that stuff in the gallery and on the campus. And literally, you will see the campus littered with strollers. Now, one thing I think it's important, too, is that when you're showing people, it's important to name them. On this side, you'll see Dwayne Mitchell. At the time, he was a senior. And he would be one of the students that would choreograph the performance that would happen when they would give a tour. So literally, Babies in the Gallery is that we would provide a tour. Students would then sing a song or sing a song in relationship to a piece. So on the other side of that wall is the Radiator Building. Mitchell had aspirations of singing on Broadway. And so when he would get to the Radiator Building, he would sing on Broadway. On this side, we're a photograph of us working with, and if I'm talking too fast, somebody raise their hand. Okay, cool. This is a photograph that we, of showing us doing a class, a workshop with the OSHA Life Learning Institute. So one thing that I like to say at Fisk is that we work with students or people from the age of 8 months to 80, which is true, and exhibited here. The next slide also speaks to what our students do, our gallery ambassadors do. They run those programs, but they also provide tours. Here is an example, or not example, the participants in Babies in the Gallery, they actually graduate. And so this is the graduation of it. And then behind them, or pictured behind them, are the original plates from the book, The Souls of Black Folks by W.B. Du Bois, printed in 1903. We used that particular book plate for 2 exhibitions, one for Artist in Resident, 1888 to present, but also Terry Atkins, Our Sons and Daughters, Ever on the Altar, who was also a Fisk alum. Another program that we did, and this was with an exhibition called Scape, 20th Century African Americans Inspired by the Built Environment. This particular program was relatively exciting because a student, Perrin Kennedy, came to me and said, you know, I really like Legos. I really want to do something. I said, okay, we'll write a proposal and I'll figure out a way to ensure that it gets done. And so literally, he wrote a proposal. I approved it. I said, okay, you're going to call Lego. He got them to sponsor it. And then we worked with our partners in the community to help bring in 35 families that had never been to campus, that had never been been to the gallery, to build these Legos while learning more about the exhibitions and what we do at Fisk. So right now, as I was talking to a few of our colleagues earlier, we're beginning to install this exhibition next week. We're fabricating the walls as we speak. I hope everything is going well. But it's our first major exhibition to tour in at least the last 30 years. And we've partnered with the American Federation for the Arts to tour the exhibition, have worked with a wonderful curator who started off as our Andy Warhol Curatorial Fellow, phenomenal scholar, Perrin Lathrop. That's helped us bring this project into fruition. The exhibition itself speaks to kind of the exchange of ideas, but also the complex connections between the African continent and artists, cultural institutions, and patrons and collectors in the US. I'm gonna go to the next slide. But what's significant about this project is the way in which we've been able to engage our students. So our students, 2/3 of our students are STEM majors. 2/3 of our students are. I would say 2/3 of our gallery ambassadors are equally STEM majors. Here we have Ian McClure and Kathy Hepp working with students, conserving objects from that collection that will be on view in the coming weeks. There was not one art history student or even an art major that participated, and then we had 17 students work on 13 different paintings. Here's another, as Kathy Hepp, the other conservator that was working, well, Ian's wife, Kathy Hepp, who's also a private conservator, discussing the treatment for Gerald Cerqueto's painting. And that's Ian working with it. That is Charles H. Patterson, philosophy and English major, doing some end painting on a Susan Aganami work as well. The other part that's really been empowering for our students too in this process is that they've also begun to, they proofed all of the images, or 4 rounds of images for the catalog. And so all of that has helped produce a sense of ownership in the project. So as we come close to opening October 6th, the students have come, they're still researching and studying all the didactic texts for the exhibition, but there's a sense of pride of ownership. And so this process has been a sense of empowering for our students, and that's something that we strive to do. Let me go to another slide. And this is all part of them going through the proofing process. To think about the broader community, this is a project that we did with Ibrahim Mahama as part of the Engine for Art, Democracy, and Justice. And we wrapped the little theater, which is 2 Civil War Army barracks butted together that form a little theater. EADJ is the brainchild of Maria Madalena Campos Pons, and the partners include Fisk, First Art Museum, and Means of Conversations, where it's a series of webinars, but we also do public interventions. This particular one is Ibrahim Mahama's work, Leave on the Grass, where these jute bags form this kind of flesh they have used for cocoa to coal and many different purposes, and they've been exhibited around the world. And so they have all these worn scars, abbreviated version. And so here's Alicia Henry working with Jansen Buchanan in preparation before we wrap the building. So I just wanted to give you all just a little bit of insight to what we're doing and how we think about empowering our students and the use of that. But I'm open to looking forward to questions at the end. Thank you. Oh, thank you.
Is this on? Great. First of all, thanks so much, Paulina, Asma, Jamaal, for those great presentations. I think, as we expected, the specificity of each of your home institution really drives what you're doing, what you're thinking about, your concerns for different audiences, and the different range of ways that you think about it. But I wanted to start first with a bigger question, one that, Asma, you kicked off by bringing up at the end, this question of values. Paulina spoke about the mission and the laboratory idea. Jamaal, you spoke about this idea of empowerment. All these are ideas of values wrapped up. And I'm just wondering, at the stage where you are now at your institution, how do the question of values come up? Who's at the table when these questions arise? And how does it play out, not just in terms of what happens with everything that one might see if you visit the museum, but kind of the cultures, other kinds of use of the kind of spirit embodied in each of your institutions. Jamaal, I'm looking at you.
Is this on? Okay, it's on. That's another complicated, loaded question.
I know.
So I'm going to try to answer it in the best way. So one value, at least what we talk about within the institution, at least the student experience, is that my goal, or my personal goal and other goal, is that we have a ton of other training programs that we have, but it's to train and develop the next generation of arts leaders. So when we're talking to the academy, that is it. And so with that, and that doesn't mean next generation of curators, that means the next generation of patrons, next generation of patrons. And so, and those a variety of tables that are present. But I would say, regardless of who is at the table, it's important to listen. And the listening process helps determine ways that we can navigate in terms of how to captivate the audience, to be inspired or be motivated to work within the gallery, or to listen to figure out ways that we can respond. And I'm thinking about two different, am I answering the question? Okay, because I'm thinking about two different instances. Being a part of a large institution, you have to navigate it, but then also listening to students, and I'm thinking about an exhibition that we did in 2017. I think it was Brown that was just assassinated, and a student said to me that he was feeling like he had PTSD. And so immediately we started thinking about ways that we can address those questions. And so we ended up doing an exhibition with Jonathan Comm, Automobility, African American Hazardous Freedoms of the Open Road. So that's one way we, who's at the table at that particular instance, the students, but when we talk about policies and other procedures, that's a different audience. But the main thing is the same, and that's to listen.
Thank you.
I'll take the question in a little bit of a different direction, David, if that's okay. I think what's been interesting while I've been co-interim director is the ways in which you can see kind of both the 30,000-foot level of how an institution works, as well as being in the weeds. And so working as closely as I am now with the board, you can really see that value alignment, mission alignment is integral to the instantiation of any mission. But I would say that the value alignment and mission alignment is only part of the story in terms of what we're trying to accomplish at the board level, because it is about having people from different perspectives, and the ways in which boards have been composed, which has recently come under greater scrutiny in the past few years, some would say decades, based on some of our activist work, I think is a crucial question. And that trickles down to what we end up putting into our collection and what we end up putting on our walls. Our accessions process draws on some board folks, as well as folks who are not part of our board. And when we have the opportunity to acquire the work of an artist like Valerie Maynard, who avoided the gallery system, had maybe one or two objects in the auction houses, and we go to our accession committee and say, we would like to bring in the work of this artist with commanding this amount of money. The values that are reflected in the approval process are an important turning point. And I know many of you have stories where sometimes those stories aren't successful. And so that's one thing. And then the other thing I will say, and then I'll turn it over to you, maybe Paulina, if you want to talk, was the Guarding the Art exhibition that we held at the museum that recently closed. That was premised on the idea that we are questioning who holds knowledge in the museum world. We turned over our collection to be curated by the security guards who work at the museum. And the guards went through our collection. They went through every stage of the process. This was a mentorship project. And I believe the values that an institution embodies should be reflected in how they treat the staff. And so I think that was a moment, I know there were some criticism of the project, meaning, is this a one-off kind of thing? How are you going to sustain that kind of mentoring? But I do think that was something that was signal.
So I think at the start of my presentation, can you hear me? I had mentioned about following the mission statement that this wasn't only something that falls on the backs of the curatorial staff. It's something that is distributed across the museum. Everyone from, who determines the value. I mean, there's so many different constituencies that kind of determine, a different set of values for different aspects of how the museum functions. Learning and engagement, our security officers are always involved in special exhibitions, in collection presentations. Our frontline staff is, it's literally every single, I would say, employee at the museum is engaged on some level in content production. And the Board of Trustees and our various acquisition committee members also on a different, right, like a kind of on the flip side of things, but that if, and a lot of times actually there is direct conversation. The other day I was walking with one of our trustees through the galleries after hours, and it's like, everyone knows each other. I mean, there is, as big of an institution as MoMA is, I think there is actually a tremendous amount of communication between the various departments on all levels, all kind of departments, and kind of both hierarchical too, from like super junior staff to chief curators.
That's very helpful. So going from the big question to values to something that I'm always interested to ask other curators, which is kind of how they pitch or sell a possible acquisition of an artwork to their colleagues or to a patron. And to me, this gets to a question of use in that one of the things that I know within our curatorial department meetings, the biggest compliment is this work, painting, drawing, video, whatever, can do a lot of work. And it's something you hear, and you know exactly what it means, because you're in that room, you know those people. But that's a big question. What does work mean? These are the questions that we're getting at today. It's a question of archive, it's a question of audience, it's a question of public dissemination. But I wonder, in your rooms, when you have these conversations, what is the equivalent of it does good work? What does that mean in your conversations? How do you talk about acquisitions in that framework?
I mean, I actually just came off of a 2-day curatorial retreat that was focusing on our collection from the 2000s to the present, and that was all just the curators in my department, painting and sculpture, and we, kind of looked at what we've acquired, kind of the type of, looking at the geographies that are covered, and sort of, kind of made a program to follow for, let's say, the next 2 or 3 years. And I think within that, with that as a kind of roadmap, you kind of, we all have artists that we love. We all have artists that we are in constant contact with, and have long relationships with. And it's it's about kind of the alignment of what does the collection need, how does that work function, and your own particular interests. And I think also you need buy-in, or we need buy-in from our departmental colleagues, but not everyone has to agree, right? Like there's dissent, and that doesn't stop an acquisition from happening, which I think makes for a livelier collection. I don't know if that answers your question, but that's certainly one approach to collecting. It's looking about, and also and Kunbi's in the audience, and she works in the Department of Drawings and Prints, and they have a slightly different approach, which I think is equally interesting, where, correct me if I'm wrong, but when a work is being proposed, you kind of immediately have to propose a context in which you could hang, what other works it can hang with. We don't have that kind of stringent of a policy in painting and sculpture, but I think that's also an interesting approach to bringing work into the collection?
I would say for the Baltimore Museum of Art, doing the work would encompass kind of how much upending of hierarchies we can do in one fell swoop. So across media, across taste, and also just kind of unmanageability in general, meaning like it's an object that seems really hard to imagine being a steward of in a museum. That's something I know sounds contrarian, but I'll give you the example of the Peacekeeper, the Nari Ward acquisition that we just brought in, which is a hearse car covered in tar and peacock feathers, crowned by a beautiful sculpture comprising exhaust pipes. It's very, very challenging to bring it in through even the museum doors. And so there's those kinds of objects trigger the kinds of questions that all of us are asking in terms of how have we bent the rules to bring in those kinds of works when they're made by artists who are already in the canon, who are white or Anglo-European. So I think the sheer rebellion is something that motivates us. But we are dwindling in our acquisitions funds, I will say that, and that's another conversation that I know we haven't had here. But it's a real challenge when you're trying to do the heavy lifting that we're all trying to do in collection building and trying to fill these gaps. And everybody around you is trying to look at these same artists, and the prices are going up, up, up to make sure that we're doing that work.
So when you first asked the question, I had in my mind a sliding scale of emojis from being happy to kind of mildly frustrated for a few reasons. One, we're at the mercy of our donors. And then even with that, there's politics involved in that as well as who's donating and why. And so that's always a complicated issue. But we try to rely on our policies to help lead us through those gentle negotiations at times with our development officers at times. But what we aspire to do, or what we're currently working on with our development officer, is to establish an acquisitions fund so that we could go out and purchase works as well. But yeah, I mean, we get a wide range of requests of donations. So,
Great. I think another question that comes when we think about use is about our relationship to the generations that will come after us. What are we preparing other people to do? Obviously in all of the incomplete ways that they're going to have to be done in order to set it up. But I think a lot of questions around use center on what we're doing now with our audiences, which is the important work. We want people to come and see this work now. Mm-hmm. But I wonder what conversations do you have within your institutions about what that future work looks like? Not just what we want to do in the next 5 years, but how we're preparing. It could be presumptuous, it could be crazy, it could be this other idea of writing these art histories before we even know what's being settled, but it's all groundwork that we're setting. So I just wondered, this question of use in the future, is that something that comes up in your conversations at your homes?
It's not a conversation that I've had. It's not a conversation that we've had kind of officially, but it's a conversation that I've certainly had kind of with myself. Mm-hmm. And I think inevitably we are just, if you look kind of retrospectively and you see how many blind spots there have been, mm-hmm. I think I'm constantly thinking about the blind spots mm-hmm. that I'm currently, that you know, that exist, that I'm, you know, that there are going to be all of these holes mm-hmm. for the next generation or 2 generations yeah. later mm-hmm. to fill, despite our best intentions to kind of, you know, collect the work that we feel is the most urgent and speaks to audiences, communicates with our audiences right now. But I think it goes to the point that was brought up for the first session, and then again, Asma, with your silhouettes about changing taste, you know, the world changing, like all of this is kind of part of a network, right? Like sometimes things make sense at a moment in time, and sometimes that same thing, you know, makes less sense, yeah. right? And so I think despite our kind of best efforts, there are going to be holes.
And I would add to that, that I think overall, all of us know that museums are in jeopardy to some degree, that we are at a point of crisis. Our relevance, our function in society, our importance in the social fabric is actually being questioned, even though it's more crucial than ever, because museums are the one space left, and I'm specifically looking at you folks on Capitol Hill, where discourse can occur across strata and be respectful and not be siloed. But so for me, I think that what's interesting about what's happening right now is that museums as collecting institutions, you know, from Capitoline Hill to Napoleon's conquests, through, you know, what Americans tried to establish when they were founding the museums on this side of the Atlantic, is you're seeing a real foundational question about what are museums for, what are collections for, and how can we change our collections to acknowledge these new set of voices. And I think that we don't have an answer.
I could spend 10 minutes talking about that question. But I'll start with thinking about Fisk as a laboratory, a space for learning. And then also thinking about what we aspire to do with many of the programs that we have, and that's to change the field. And so we have a program which is called a suite of programs which is called the Fisk Museum Leadership Initiative. Out of that is the Fisk Museum Leadership Program, which that gave students a crash course in every aspect of the museum, where we would, you know, work with our partners. Our partners were, of course, Crystal Bridges, the O'Keeffe Museum, Yale, Princeton, of course, University of Delaware was also a wonderful partner, and the HBCU Alliance that we recruited from. Now, what's come out of that is a 2-year fellowship with LACMA that's looking at collections care and registration, and a Flickr program, which is kind of an intensive that we recruit students to work with our collections manager after they've gone through this 1-week intensive, working with maybe 50 people from their staff at LACMA. And then, of course, the Bank of America Conservation Intensive. So what we aspire to do is kind of break the pipeline and flood the market in some kind of way. But then on the other side, and this is going back to thinking about the many publics that we serve, the community that we serve, at least the North Nashville community, within a 2-mile radius, there are 2 museum magnets, elementary school and a middle school. And so we're always looking at ways to expand our capacity, not with our staff, but our students, to engage these students earlier, because in the other programs, what we found is by the time we get them in the museum, the vast majority of the time it's too late for them to go into the field. And so with that, we're working to build better relationship with those 2 museum magnets, but also have a staff person that's dedicated to those museum magnets, is what we're working on right now. And then, yeah, that's it. There's a little bit more, but I don't want to take any more time to talk through those. I'll just spend a little bit of time talking about it too. And thinking about marginalized collections or artists that have not been represented in the canon or discussed in the canon more broadly. What I try to do is to be a conduit or an advocate. So if you called me and said, hey, I'm interested in this work, I'm going to ask you to consider 3 other objects, 3 other artists that you may be looking at, with the hope that another historian will pick up the baton and continue to do more scholarship. And that's one of the big things for the show that's getting ready to open, is that this is seeding artists that I hope that somebody else will then pick it up and take it much further.
Fantastic. Thank you, Jamaal. I think it's time to take questions from the audience here. So I know that there are 2 microphones for anyone who might have a question.
Yeah, great discussion. Jamaal, my question is to you. What is the direction of the gallery during the last 50 years as far as acquiring new work, even the last 20 years maybe, as far as like urban culture, hip-hop culture, which I'm pretty sure the students are into. And there's a lot of art going on in that perspective. Is there any initiative of gathering art in the last 50 years?
speak to that. You know, when I started, you would think that there was, well, let me backtrack. Post-1980, you see a cliff in our collection. And so you see, I mean, we can presume that there's reasons why, especially when you get to artists that were making work in the 90s, there's a huge gap. And so that's an area that we're looking in right now of growth. And so I'm very much interested in new media, digital media, and photography, and those areas of growth that we're looking into.
Hi, I wanted to ask you a question as well, Jamaal. I was very impressed that you have elderly people. I've got a history of teaching teenagers and high schoolers, and I recently started working with dementia patients and therapy and elder community. And I was very interested in how you got them to come in. And I just think it's something very important. I wanted to also address that to everybody because there's so many elderly people in this city, and it's a growing, group of us. I'm heading there, for sure, we all are. But it's a massive, exploding population. And I didn't know, I was just interested to know how you're all going to get people in, and because there's so much wealth of knowledge and conversation starting points and opportunities for community as well.
Oh, yeah. The primary way, or the program, is through the OSHA Life Learning Institute. And so that's a organization that caters toward seniors. But you're absolutely right. They're a wealth of information. And literally, before we started partnering with them, one of my first volunteers is, well, at that time, she was 83. She's probably 89 now. And she was the main reason why I was able to recruit students to work in the gallery, because of that wealth of knowledge and storytelling that they have. And so it's rich and edifying to have our seniors working with us or participating in programs in the gallery. So.
Thanks so much. I have a question about the role of artists. So David prompted sort of a number of stakeholders. We heard about donors, we heard about staff. I'm curious, Asma, you touched on Fred Wilson, our trustee. Here we've seen in our biennials, Chris Rodriguez's work examining the travel of objects into and out of a collection. We have Alex DeCourte's work talking metaphorically about objects in a collection. How have artists, living artists, deceased artists' work changed or provoked your thoughts about the role of a collection in a museum space and the potential for it?
Is this for anyone?
Anyone, Andrew? Yes.
I mean, I think for me, that's like the central part of my job is being in constant dialogue with artists, bringing them to the museum, just kind of, very casually. These relationships turn into friendships, and very casually, you kind of bounce around ideas, and something more often than not, grows out of that relationship, whether it's an acquisition, whether it's a special presentation, whether it's a book, and just kind of starting kind of, and I think through the individual bringing, and through those relationships, you start bringing artists into kind of the ecosystem of the museum at large, right? So then it stops being just, Jane and I are friends, but no, Jane now is, known to the department, is doing programming at the museum, if that's of interest to her. I picked Jane because she's sitting there. I think, so in the case of my experience at MoMA, but I think I would say this is true for all artists that work with contemporary art at MoMA, artists are really at the heart and center of the program and its development. We respond to their needs and their interests.
Andrew, I want to thank you for that question, because I think what you're perhaps hinting at, maybe I'm mistaken, is something that I've been trying to imagine a new future for, which is how can artists be better integrated into some of the key decision making that we make? And the question hasn't really been asked in a hard way at the Baltimore Museum of Art anyway, because when you talk to artists, their knowledge is kaleidoscopic. You know, they'll be talking about folks that you may have seen, you know, one time in a book somewhere, or you saw one time, you know, walking through a museum. And it's not just their knowledge, but also the ways in which they can, because they're artists, they can create these beautiful connections and imagine new constructs that we haven't imagined. So I greatly appreciate your question, and I think it's a good impetus for further thought.
Just to quickly follow, actually, like in advance of the 2019 expansion, we invited, you know, all sorts of people to the museum, historians, museum professionals, but artists were absolutely a category of people that we were, you know, looking at models with, asking, you know, getting feedback from, workshopping ideas with. So, you know, it's like as part of, you know, I think artists are really kind of at the heart of what we do at MoMA.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm gonna take a quick stab at it, and I'm gonna echo what the panelists have said, and summarize it to say that artists can help us identify the gaps, but also artists are leading in a lot of ways, and then we're following behind the lag. And so we're working to tackle some of those difficult questions, or at least a difficult question, that's social justice at Fisk. And so we have, through the Luce Foundation, we've established these 3 residencies: a technologist in social justice fellowship, a social justice fellowship, and then an artist that has a social practice, that they're all working together to kind of think through as a think tank, to kind of think through some of those issues and working with our students.
Yeah, I was very happy, Asma, when you talked about Valerie Maynard's talking about young women who she wanted. That was kind of an ideal audience. And I think artists have this way of really getting to the heart of this question, that we can never think so broadly that we can ever encompass the audience. And I think of Felix Gonzalez Torres talking about the perfect audience being one person for him. So I do think that power of reminding ourselves that specificity is good, asking artists who they want to reach is very powerful, and then letting those voices echo, because I think it's extremely presumptuous to know how an artwork will echo for a person, but artists kind of know what's going to resound and how they resound in different ways.
Oh, hello. I'm an artist, a curator, and a historian, and I started with oral history and have collected women's art and women's stories on tape since the 76 on. And I'm just overwhelmed. Women are dying. I'm going and visiting, like even this week, people that are in last stage cancer. It's just been one artist after another passing away, especially the ones that have large objects. The women, which I spoke to a generation ahead of me about this problem, where there's so many women, they haven't even been seen, even though many of us showed throughout the 80s and 90s, and we had a TV series, we have all these tapes. I'm just trying to keep everything together. And with someone, we also worked on multicultural integration, how to work together, talked about race, class, all these issues I have on tape. They're very fragile. I don't know any artists of my generation that have even been able to contact a curator directly, because it's almost the opposite is presented. And this is New York City, where I've lived since '76 on, and I'm trying to collect people before they're gone, at least get a photograph, at least talk to them. And this is happening rapidly with women that are now in their 70s and 80s, and it's been going on before. It's different than even one woman I lived with, and I have a loft that had many artists, and one woman passed away of AIDS. She started the Pyramid Club. She was really well known at her time. I worked in the club scene and in the knitting factory and all this period about the whole stories of how people integrated the downtown scene. They haven't been told at all. It's more the focus has been on a lot of artists that are famous. They're already well known. So they're given the permission to tell the story, but they're not our stories. And so I want to know what is the way that the curators tell you about they talk to artists? I don't know any of the artists that I know that are able to talk to curators directly that are in this later stage. And this includes all cultures. There's women, my black women artist friends, the same age period, the 70s, have had a hard time getting any type of recognition or anyone even to look at their work. How can this be rectified? And this is in New York City, been very active the whole time. And it's just been, it's almost like a class difference or because of an academic difference or something, but actually what happened, the real history and what people did has not been integrated or put down. It's almost compartmentalized. Thank you.
Well, I'll jump in since I work here, and I think this is a question that shows how much work there is to be done. I think acknowledging that work needs to be done is one of the first things that we can do. I hope you know that there are curators here who are very interested in the histories that you are talking about. Can more work be done? Absolutely, and I'd love to talk to you during the coffee break. I think the larger question is one that Jamaal has spoken about, as well as Asma and Paulina. Who's doing the work? Who are the conversations being had with? How do these questions become part of narratives that we tell? Then how do they end up within the institution, not just as something in the periphery to it? So I don't have an answer. You've posed really great questions, but look forward to talking to you later.
I think we have like 2 minutes left. Sorry, I was not on it. So we can do one last question, and then we invite everyone for a coffee break. Where was the question? Okay.
Thanks, Megan.
Thank you to all the panelists present and this morning. This maybe is a sleeping giant across all the panels, but what do we do about the market? Because Asma, your very good point about how do we reconcile when we bring things and there is no record, there's very little auction or there's very little gallery record for artists that we believe should be in collections. How do we reconcile artists who maybe never went into the big art fairs, never went into the market? And today's question is really about equity, disparity, adjusting this across acquisitions, employment, everything that we're doing. But I do feel like that the numbers are still running, they're still trending based on the global market. And even after all this time in the pandemic, all the art fairs are back, and they're roaring. And I still feel like this may be one of the loudest voices in our industry.
Karen, money and power have still rule the day. And to the previous questioner's point, there's those who are on the inside, and then there's those who are on the outside. And in many ways, things have not changed. And so, I think that there may be ways that are more subtle for all of us in our daily practices as curators, as stewards of a collection, to start to implement the kinds of game-changing conversations that we're talking about today. Meaning, I know, for example, just to give you a very specific process that we go through in acquiring works, when we present a work to the accession committee, we note what other collections the work is held. Well, what is that doing? That's reinforcing, that somebody already has achieved a status quo. So, I'm not saying that we shouldn't ever say that, but in many ways, the fact that an artist is not held in a prominent collection, that is emerging, that hasn't been on the market, needs to achieve its own kind of value when we're talking to the key folks who are making these decisions.
And I guess to that, I would just add that that a lot of the acquisitions we've been making, especially over the last 3 years, are very outside. Not every acquisition, but a lot of them are very outside of the market. Like that last slide that I showed you included Dalton Paula, an Afro-Brazilian, very young artist. I think I don't know if he's in any other museum collection in the United States, perhaps. Kamala Ishak, a Sudanese artist, definitely has no gallery representation in New York. I think museums are trying not to, do the market. The market's there. It's always going to be there. You deal with it. But I think that there's ways of looking kind of beyond it or around it. I think we're capable of doing multiple things at the same time.
Well, I think we're at the end of the session. Just want to thank Paulina, Asma, Jamaal for all of your contributions. Thank you so much.